Welcome to Unlocking Science. Our goal is to glorify God by studying and unlocking the secrets of His amazing creation. I'm your host, Mr. P, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Rivera. And what brings you here today to join us on Unlocking Science?
Well, we're going to be looking at forensic hair analysis and the distinct differences between human hair and properties that we see in animal fur.
Okay, so I will be following along on Ken Ham's Facebook page. We're live today, so if you have questions or comments, we'll try and monitor that and ask those things to Dr. Rivera as we're discussing this topic. So what got you interested in this topic of forensic hair, or more broadly, forensics?
Well, I just love forensic science. So having taught forensic science for many years, as well as worked in a crime scene unit, I'm really interested in those properties that make us unique, especially which distinguish humans from other things that we see in God's creation.
Okay, so we're only part of God's creation.
Yes.
We're creatures just like the animals and other things we see around us. And we're going to be talking today specifically about hair and fur and those types of coverings that are on specific types of animals. So if we think about where we find hair, we're not going to find it on something like Claude. Claude's a lobster. He's an arthropod, so he doesn't have hair or fur. He's got a solid coating and exoskeleton around him. So only certain types of animals are going to have hair and fur on them. We typically refer to that group as mammals.
Mammals, yes.
Okay, those things. All right, so we're going to be talking about the hair we find on mammals, how it's different from what we find on humans, and then talk specifically about how we have some forensic applications doing crime scene investigation, those types of things.
Yeah.
All right, why don't you go ahead and jump into your presentation then.
Okay, well, we're going to start with God's Word, right? Because it's very important. It tells us in Luke that, God loves us so much that at any time He knows the exact number of hairs on our head, right? And it says, the Bible tells us He takes care of the birds, right? He takes care of everything in His creation, but He loves humans so much that at any time, right, even though our hair is falling out all the time and growing back in continuously, and we're going to take a look at the growth stage here in just a minute, is that He knows the exact number of hairs, right? We are extremely valuable to God. If we also take a look at God's Word and say, well, when would hair have been created, specifically human hair, right? Well, the Bible tells us that God created humans on day 6 of the creation week, just 6,000 years ago, right? And all of our mammals that we just talked about, right? Lions and dogs and everything that does have fur would have been created on day 6. But there is a flying mammal that was created on day 5, bats, all right? They are flying creatures. They would have been created on day 5 according to what God's Word tells us in the book of Genesis. And we can trust God's Word, perfect and true, from the very first verse. All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is someone named Edmund Lockhart. There's a reason that we use hair and fur for forensic application, and that is because of this gentleman who was known as the Sherlock Holmes of France. That was kind of his nickname. He actually started the very first crime lab as well. But he had a principle that said when two objects come into contact with one another, there's an exchange of materials between them, all right? No two things can rub against each other. You can't walk into a room and not leave a piece of yourself behind. And hair is one of those things that we do often find because it does fall out so easily. So because of that, we have this what we call trace evidence, little microscopic things and hairs that are left behind that we can use to try and link back to get an individual identification on someone. So there are several reasons why hair is valuable in forensic investigation, and one is the structural appearance. We can look at it under the microscope and immediately tell whether it is human or whether it is animal based on what we see under the microscope. We can also possibly get some genetic identity from that, or a genetic fingerprint, we would call it. We primarily have to have the follicle for that, where the DNA is located, but sometimes there's a potential to get some more information just depending on how viable that hair sample is. Also, there are little critters living in our hair. Like we can see here, this is a full-grown lice, all right? So sometimes you can get valuable information from that as well. Also, we use hair because it does resist decomposition. If you've ever, seen an animal maybe that's been like hit by a car and it's on the side of the road, one of the last things that you see decomposing there is going to be their hair in addition to their skeletal structure. Also, it does retain its structural features for a long time, so that evidence can remain for quite some time after something has deceased. There are chemical markers as well. Your hair is basically a history of your health, all right? So certain types of illnesses, as well as treatments, as well as medications that you may have taken, will show up in your hair under chemical analysis, and they can be with you for some time, especially in ladies, because we wear our hair longer. Of course, the more frequently you get your hair cut, the less history that would be there. All right, and you can see here an example of healthy versus damaged hair. All right, you can see what happens to our cuticle structure as it gets damaged. Those scales do start to peel back and become almost frayed. So this is why we need a haircut sometimes, right? We need to go get that damaged hair cut off so that we have this nice, smooth, healthy hair where our scales lay nice and flat. All right, another reason that we use hair, and the primary reason we would use it in forensics, is because it has the potential to provide that unique identity, all right? So one important distinction I like to make is, especially in the presentations that I give here at the museum, is that we find hair in humans, right? We are made in the image of God, and we are distinctly different than the other creations that do have what I like to say is fur, all right? So we do find fur in animals, and we do find hair in humans, and we're going to see there are distinct differences between those two as we move through the presentation today. So what we would hope to get from finding a hair sample is that DNA fingerprint that we call it, being able to find viable DNA, and we would refer to that as nuclear DNA, which is found in the nucleus of a human cell. We can also determine hair color very quickly. We can even roughly get an idea of someone's, what we say, ethnicity or people group from that hair sample. Now this image you see here is of the three major, we would say, ethnic groups identified by the FBI. This picture is actually taken from the FBI website. And they do use certain terms to distinguish individuals, based on these three groups. Of course, we recognize here at the Creation Museum that there are no races, right? There's just one race, the human race. We are made in the image of God. We share 99% of our DNA. In fact, the Bible tells us in Acts 17:26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. But we can look at a hair sample and roughly estimate which people group that person may be originated from. Also, we can determine growth stage, all right? So we can look at that, and we'll actually look at the 4 stages of hair growth in just a minute, but can at least give us an idea of what stage that hair may have been at when it was pulled out or fell out. Also, we can determine structure and species, and this is very important when we look at animals versus human hair. Now you can see here in this diagram we have a human hair sample here, and then we have a dog, and we have a deer, and a rabbit, and a cat, and a mouse, all right? Each one showing a very distinctly different pattern in that hair sample or fur sample, all right? So we can compare those and very quickly look at that hair sample or fur sample under the microscope and say this is definitely human, or this is definitely a cat, or this is definitely a dog. Now it is important to note at this point, forensic scientists would say we cannot guarantee with 100% certainty that a dog from an individual's house is that specific dog, but we could say that it is a dog, from that general, we would say, animal kind. Now also, people have some common questions about hair, all right? And so one question is, can we determine ethnicity? And we just determined that yes, we can. We can look at a hair sample and at least get a general idea of what people group they may have come from. Also, can we determine what specific area of the body that sample is from? Yes, we can, all right? We can definitely determine head hair from, let's say, arm hair or your eyebrow, all right? Also, question, can we determine gender, all right? Can we distinguish a hair and determine, a male versus a female? And the answer is possibly. A few years ago, the answer would have been definitely no, but they have successfully in labs and in very limited terms been able to distinguish and correctly identify someone's gender based on that hair sample, but it is not a prevalent test yet. Also, can we determine age? All right. Well, actually, the answer is no. We really can't unless it is an infant. So if you've ever seen a newborn baby and they have that peach fuzz that's kind of on their hair, we could look at that and know right away that that is from an infant. And also we can look at an elderly hair and get at least an idea of someone's age. But I always like to say, you know, I started going gray at 28. I've been dyeing my hair for some time. Gray hair is not always a sign that someone is elderly. But, you know, the Bible does say in Proverbs that gray hair is a sign of glory. So, Mr. Patterson, you must feel really proud,
I
right?
am so wise.
That you're wearing that crown of glory.
I call my gray hair, these are my wisdom streaks.
Exactly.
Running through the side of my hair over here.
So he has lived a righteous life, all right? So we should be proud of our gray hair. Also, question is, can we determine forced removal? Can you tell if a hair has been pulled out versus fallen out naturally? The answer is yes. All right, we can tell, especially on the hair follicle. You'll actually see some ripped tissue there under the microscope. If you just yank one of your hairs out, it looks distinctly different than if you brush it out and it falls out naturally because it's ready to come out. That follicle dries up and it just looks different. Also, can we determine animal kinds? And we touched on this a little bit already, but the answer is yes. All right, we can. We can look at a hair sample or fur sample and know immediately, like I said, whether it is a human or what animal kind that sample may have originated from. All right, so it sounds wonderful, right? And especially if you watch TV, I always like to tell people, if you watch those crime scene shows on TV, everything looks so easy, all right? And hair analysis is a great tool, but there are a lot of issues using hair analysis in forensic investigations. There's lots of, it's very difficult. So one is that you really have to have the root, all right, of the hair, where the hair follicle is located, in order to get that DNA that we need, that nuclear DNA. So let's just take a look at what nuclear DNA is. Nuclear DNA does come from the nucleus, all right, of the human cell, all right? And you can see the nucleus right here, all right? We only have one nucleus per cell, all right? And that is where we find nuclear DNA, which is in the chromosomes found inside the nucleus of our cell. Now, what there is often a lot more of is something called mitochondrial DNA. Now, even if we successfully get nuclear DNA, there's only a 60 to 70% chance that it's viable enough to make that profile. So it's still not a 100% guarantee. Now, something we find a lot more of is what we call mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria of the human cell, located outside the nucleus, and there are multiple mitochondria per cell. Therefore, we just find a lot more of it. The problem with mitochondrial DNA is it's not discriminating to one individual like nuclear DNA is, all right? Mitochondrial DNA is passed through the female line, so we could eliminate families. We could say, you know, this is, the hair sample comes from a mother and her children, but not necessarily which person that may be, all right? So if we take a look at this chart, it kind of breaks it down for you. You can see here we have nuclear DNA, the information found in the nucleus of the human cell, information from mom, dad, grandparents, all of that contained in you, making you unique, versus mitochondrial DNA, which is only passed through the female line. So we have part of the information, but not all the information we need for 100% unique identity. Also, chemical treatments can damage the potential of getting that nuclear DNA from the cell. So if you dye your hair like I do, all right, you're going to damage the potential of getting viable DNA from your follicles. Also, cleaning agents, the more you wash your hair, you damage potential for that as well. And of course, the age of the sample. The longer the sample has been maybe exposed to weather and different elements, or if it's been outside, the less likelihood there is that you're going to be able to get viable DNA from that. Do we have any questions yet? Are we doing okay?
We have several people join us. So hello to Morgan and Gianna and Isabella and Tommy and Jewel, some of our faithful viewers checking in with us. And the one question that did come in from Morgan is the mouse hair thicker than the cat or the dog hair?
Oh,
so,
in diameter.
Yeah, if we talk about the diameter, the mouse hair would definitely be a smaller diameter, but it might be denser. So if you could look at the number of hairs per square inch on a mouse, that might be denser. So the fur, we'd say the fur is denser in a mouse than it would be on a dog, for example. Okay.
So we're going to take a look at some hair structures and features. We're going to touch on anatomy just a little bit. I always like to point out, you see here the Guinness World Book Records holder for the longest hair recorded. But it's important to realize that most of us don't have the genetic capability to grow our hair that long. All right, certain people are predisposed with the ability to grow their hair very long, but for the most part, we can only grow our hair about down to our knees. I always like to say, if you think of Crystal Gale, the old country singer, she always had her hair down to her knees. That's about the maximum length that most people can grow their human hair. So we're going to come over here and we're going to take a look at this model of human hair that we see here.
Go ahead and stand it up here.
Yeah, we're going to stand it up. So we can see down here is where we have our hair follicle, all right? This is the area, all right, where we're going to find the potential for that nuclear DNA that we were talking about.
Okay, so all of this layer that we're looking at here, this would be the epidermis, these upper 3 layers of the skin, and then the dermis down here. Or, I'm sorry, dermis and epidermis, backward. So we've got these layers where the skin is holding on to all of these hair follicles. So the surface of the skin is up here.
Yes, surface of the skin is up here. So down here is our viable cells, or our living cells, and that's why we find potential for nuclear DNA down there. That's what we need to be able to get that kind of information. But once that hair starts to grow out of the surface of the skin, those cells die.
Yeah,
all right?
and if it's a dead cell, it doesn't have any nuclear material in it. And this is just basically a protein we call keratin, arranged in a certain structure, so it doesn't have any DNA in it. We can do protein analysis, and as you mentioned, there are some different types of chemical analysis. That protein will hold certain chemical markers in it, and we can use that as information to help determine whether this person has been exposed to radiation or certain medications. Those types of things would show up in that protein structure, but not DNA. The DNA is not in the strand of the hair.
And it's actually really good that by the time our hair gets out here that those cells are dead, because when you got your hair cut, if they weren't,
it would hurt.
It might hurt. And that's why when you pull your hair out of your follicle, and you might want to try this at home, what do you feel? You feel a little bit of pain, right?
And don't do that to your brothers and sisters.
No, definitely not. But that's why when we go to get our hair cut, we don't feel anything because those cells are dead, right? And so you feel no pain once you get your hair cut.
But there are nerves down here in the skin, and you can also see different glands that are associated with the skin and with the hair. And we've got sweat glands and oil glands. And
oil glands, and they're directly connected to our hair follicles. And so this is why some people have more oilier hair than others, or certain times of life when we're more hormonal, you may secrete more oils into your hair. And that's because your sebaceous glands are directly connected to your hair follicles.
So if we wanted to get a sample of DNA from an intact hair at a crime scene, it would basically have to have been pulled out with the follicle and all, this core down here where some of the living tissue around the base of the follicle is there and pulled out with it. Otherwise, there's not going to be good DNA to extract.
We could determine color, and we could determine a couple, maybe, like I said, people group, but as far as getting potential DNA, highly unlikely.
So just finding a little piece of hair snagged in a door frame doesn't guarantee a DNA match.
Exactly.
Unlike the crime scene shows we might see.
And if we do get it with the hair follicle, I've been told from a forensic hair analysis expert who's working in a lab right now, he was actually in one of my workshops, it's about a 99% chance they can get an individual identity from that. So if we have the follicle, very likely. But unless you have that,
not going to happen.
Not going to get DNA analysis, definitely not. Okay, so we're going to move back over here. All right, and so we did briefly talk about where the hair follicle is located, all right, but we're going to look at the 3 basic parts of an individual hair, and that is the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. All right, the cuticle is that outside protective coating that does make your hair waterproof, and it has other features like that because God's pretty smart. He thinks about that. All right, our cortex is where we do find our cells and our melanin color, and then in here is something we call the medulla, and it's basically what they call an airspace. But here is where we find something very important that we can look at under the microscope and distinguish between animal kinds. There are 3 basic medulla patterns, all right? And that is continuous. Now in a continuous pattern, we see this solid black line running up through the center right here, all right? In a fragmented medulla pattern, all right, we can see where it's actually broken. It's almost like Morse code. It actually looks like dots and dashes running up the center of the hair shaft. And then some people actually what we call absent, all right, where you literally just don't see a pattern in the medulla at all. Sometimes you'll see a hair sample that looks like this, where the medulla is a little more present, but you still don't see a distinct continuous or fragmented pattern running up the center of the hair shaft. Now these are all human hairs that you see here. What we're going to find though when we go look at animals, it is distinctly different. All right. Now hair does go through 4 basic growth stages. The first one is the anagen stage. This is where your hair stays the longest, between 2 to 7 years. This is where your hair is happy, right? That's why we see a smiley face. This is where your hair is growing, all right? But then it's going to go to the catagen stage. And when it reaches this stage, it's starting to die. So it's going to start to dry up. If you think of a grape going to a raisin, it's kind of that idea. This follicle will start to dry up because it's getting ready to release. Then it will reach the telogen stage, and when it gets here, it is ready to come out. All right. At this stage is when you could brush your hair and it comes out and you don't feel anything, or you put a shirt on to go to school, that hair comes out, you never feel any pain because it falls out naturally. And then at this point, by the time it's already in telogen, it is already entering early anagen, all right, as that new hair begins to grow in, because God created us to have continuous hair growth. It falls out, it grows in. You don't even realize that's occurring, which is a distinct trait we see in humans. So we need to talk just a little bit about the distinct differences between human hair and animal fur, all right? Because evolutionists like to say, well, because we share these traits with animals, it's part of that evidence they like to call that we've descended from a common ancestor. And that is just not the case, all right? God equipped us each with exactly what we needed to survive in our environment. So if we take a look at human hair versus animal fur, one thing we're going to see a difference in is growth. In humans, as I said, our hair is continuous and it is independent, meaning it's all over our head at different times and at different stages. Whereas in animal fur, it is stopped and it is synchronized, all right? Especially in animals, if we notice in the winter, especially when it's up in the areas where it's colder, they're going to get much thicker, right, in their fur. Then in the spring, what happens is they start to shed, right? You start to get fur, especially my cat sheds in the spring. I get cat fur all over my house because he is shedding that. And they do stop. Their hair does stop growing at very distinct stages. I mean, does a cow need to go to the hair salon? No, right? God equipped them to have their hair stop at a very specific point. Also, diameter. In humans, on average, the diameter or the thickness, we would say, of our hair is much thinner than we are going to see in animals. Also, our medulla patterns are thinner. And we're going to see this when we look at our pictures here in just a second, that animals have a much wider and more prominent, we would say, medulla. And as far as our texture in humans, on average, you know, our hair is soft and has the potential to grow very long. But in animals, it is coarse and often very short. Right? Now, there are rare exceptions because we have purposely crossed certain traits, especially of dogs, to have long hair. But that is not how they would normally exist in nature. Also, temperature regulation. In humans, our hair provides us absolutely no temperature regulation whatsoever. All right. In the winter, does your arm hair keep you warm, Mr. Patterson?
Not really.
No.
I usually have to put on a jacket or
yeah.
something.
Does our head hair keep us warm in the winter?
It does, yeah, because it's a lot thicker, but it's
But
still...
what do we have to put on if it's snowing?
We've got to put on a cap if it's that cold, because it's still a little thin and things can penetrate through
Right.
there.
So in the winter, you still have to put on that hat, right? Because it is not going to keep you warm. Your leg hair is not going to keep you warm, right? But what about animals? Absolutely, right? God designed them to thicken up in the winter, thin out in the summer when it's warmer, and their fur is specifically designed to regulate their body temperature and allow them to live outside. And color is another distinct difference. In humans, on average, we have constant hair color, all right? That's not to say we may be lighter brown in the front or darker brown in the back, and we do get gray because our cells die, our color, we just don't produce color anymore. But on average, it's constant, right? You're never going to see a human with naturally growing zebra stripes, right, in their hair patterns. You're never going to see a human who has, like a cow, black, and brown and mustard color splotches. God just didn't create us that way. Our hair is a constant color. But in animals, you can absolutely have abrupt color change, sometimes within the same fur sample. Very distinct differences. Now, the FBI even recognizes that human hair is distinctly different. They say in human hairs, the scales form an imbricate pattern. This characteristic serves to distinguish human hairs from animal hairs. Many animal hairs have a very regular repeating pattern to their scales. So even the FBI on their website had to acknowledge that human hair is distinctly different from animal fur. And that's exactly what we'd expect to see because we are made in the image of God. So we're going to take a look at a few samples now, all right, of animals and humans side by side. So this first example is a primate sample, four different samples of primate fur next to samples of human hair. Remember we said human hair, their medulla pattern is thinner, and we can see that in evidenced here. Remember the medulla is this pattern that we have running up the center of the hair shaft here. Now if you take a look, you're going to see the distinct difference between human and animals, all right? If we look at the medulla pattern of this primate right here, this pattern running up the center, looks distinctly different from human hair, all right? Primate fur is distinctly different from human hair. There are no similarities at all in their medulla patterns. Very important. Also, we can take a look at alpacas, all right? So this is Alfonso. He is one of our alpacas out here at the Creation Museum. So we're about to open June 8th, and please come out and visit us. You can come see our animals that are out there. And so I do have different fur samples from our animals out there, and we'll take a look at a few of those. And this is actually Alfonso's here. We can see alpaca hair here. Also, we have Gomer, who is our camel, and very wide. Remember I said animals have an extremely wide medulla pattern compared to humans? Look at his medulla. All right, he has a continuous medulla, and look how wide it is. That is distinctly different from what we saw in our human sample that we just looked at. We also have Peaches. Now Peaches is one of my cats, all right? Peaches is Fluffy. He's the one that gets hair all over my house in the spring, all right? But you can see that Peaches, all right, this is actually his fur sample that we see here. Cats have what looks like almost like a pearl pattern, medulla pattern. It almost looks like little tiny circles stacked on top of one another. Very distinct in cats. So you could immediately look at a member of the felid family under the microscope, and you would know right away that it is from some animal in the cat family. And you can see Peaches up close here. And once again, you see these almost like little tiny pearls that are stacked on top of each other. Now, if we take a look at dogs, now this is Harley. This is actually Dr. Georgia Purdum's dog, all right? His name is Harley. And what we see in dogs is almost, I like to call it almost like a Lego block pattern, whereas in cats they were pearls. In dogs, they're almost like blocks, like you see here, stacked on top of one another, distinctive of our canine kind. Now, when we take a look at horses, horses, they say, have a mosaic pattern. And what that means is it's very irregular and it almost looks like little broken pieces of tile that are put together like you see here, all right? And so this is very signature of anything within the horse kind. Our equines, you can see that here from, this is actually Jigsaw, the little pony that you see there, his fur pattern. And this is our Zorz and Zonky, who used to be here at the Creation Museum, but now they're down at the Ark Encounter, Cletus and Zoe. And once again, look at the very extremely wide medulla pattern that we have in our horse kind, all right? Distinctly different from, the human kind that we were talking about. And also, it's important, just like we have different pattern types in humans, right? We have 3 pattern types, so do horses. So as we saw in our last horse, he had a very mosaic type pattern. Well, these are also from the horse kind, but just as humans have different patterns, so will animals within their same kind as well. All right, this is our Kentucky rabbit. All right, you can see beautiful pattern here. They call this like it's called a multicellular ladder or something. This specific pattern is called. Very distinctive of our rabbit kind. And we also have our black-tailed deer. And I actually threw this in just for Mr. Patterson.
I'm a big deer hunter, so we had to throw in a few deer.
He's a big deer hunter, yes. So I had to throw a deer in for him. Very distinctive of our deers. And we also have seals, all right? Unlike any other medulla pattern we've looked at today. Beautiful, very distinct pattern. that would signify any animal within the seal family. So what's important to realize is that these different animals that we're looking at, all right, each have their own unique patterns within their created kinds. And that's extremely important, right? Because it defies, right, evolutionary theory. Right?
Yeah, if these all came from the same basic evolutionary origin, we should expect very similar patterns in them, but we see very distinct patterns in those created kinds.
Yeah, very different.
Yeah. All right, let's try and answer some of the questions we've got coming in here.
Sure.
We've got a question from Morgan that asks, how can you tell the difference between fake hair, like what you might find in a wig, and somebody else asked about that, and real hair, if you found them at a crime scene?
Right. Well, fake hair, anything from a wig, unless it was made with human hair. Sometimes wigs are actually made with human hair. They're very expensive.
Yes.
But any kind of fake wig is pretty much made out of acrylic. And so just like comparing a cotton fiber to a synthetic fiber in clothing, it looks distinctly different, and that would apply to wigs as well.
Sure, just a simple look, even under a magnifying glass.
Yes,
you would
even
be
under
able to
magnifying
tell
glass.
the difference between a synthetic fiber. It's going to have a very smooth outside edge. There won't be any
no scale
scaling
patterns,
on the cuticle and those types
no
of
medulla
things.
patterns.
None of those things. All right. Isabella asks, I've heard that hair is really just dead skin. Is that true? Well, to some extent, it's a dead part that grows out of your skin. It's got a very specific protein structure that's different from your skin, but it definitely is a dead part that grows out of the core of your skin. So it's not quite accurate to say it's just dead skin.
But it is dead cells.
It's dead cells that are organized into protein structure that form out of the skin, coming out of the layers of the skin there. All right, so what exactly in the furs of animals causes allergies for humans, Jennifer asks. It's not the hairs themselves. Right. It's usually the dandruff, the skin particles that are on and attached to it and around it that cause that reaction in your body. Just like if you get pollen or things, it's that type of antigen response that your body forms as an immune response. So it's not the hairs that you're allergic to probably. And it can also be the little mites and other critters that are living on the hairs that you're allergic to. So that's another interesting one. Let's see. Okay, here's something we can touch on. Jennifer also asks, what exactly in the, oh, that was the same one, I'm sorry. Let's see, are whiskers on animals considered hair or fur, Gianna asks. Those are actually a special type of hair. They're a tactile hair, so they grow out of the same type of follicle, but they have lots of nerves that surround that, and they're sensory hairs that can detect the movement inside of that follicle and provide information and feedback. So that's why, especially animals that move around a lot at night have long whiskers, because they can move around at night, and as they brush into things, it can tell them how close they are to objects and those types of things.
And whiskers would look different under the microscope than head hair. Just like we said, you can determine which area of the body your hair came from. It's the same thing with whiskers.
Yeah, and they grow to a specific length. The whiskers are often much longer than the body hair of an animal. Okay, the other question was, what's the difference between hair and fur? And here's where we can kind of get into the weeds and parse some terms, but really, we think of fur as coming from animals, and it's usually much more densely populating the skin. There are lots more follicles per square inch. And fur is really made up of lots of individual types of hair. Now, there could be different layers of fur. So we think of fur having under hair and guard hairs. So an under hair is usually a denser layer underneath that's a bit shorter, and then the guard hairs stick out from that. So if you see an animal shedding its fur during different times of the year, then that can be an example of losing some of that really dense under fur. Those little hairs fall off, and it's replaced by shorter, finer hairs underneath. And then in the winter, when it gets cold, God's equipped them to be able to replace that. So fur is really just a lot of hairs built together, but they've got, it's a very different structure than we think about.
And
what
much
we have
coarser
with
than
humans.
human hair.
Sure, much coarser.
Yeah.
And somebody else brought up the other point that there was another type of creature created on day 5 that actually had hair too, and that would be the whales and the dolphins.
Sea
and those
creatures,
things
sure.
that we classify as mammals because they have hair as well. All right, so lots of great information. When you think about this from a crime scene investigation unit, and you have to think about all the different types of evidence that could be collected, how does hair rank as an example that gets commonly used? Is it usually used in a crime scene or rarely? How often do you use that?
Honestly, it's not. It's very rare that a hair sample is ever actually successful in convicting someone, and it's not even enough by itself to convict someone. It could be circumstantial evidence, right? And it could help build a case, but one hair sample alone really is not going to be quite enough because there's still so much variability in that.
Sure, lots of other ways that hair could have got there.
Exactly.
Different things that could have happened. So important in some
Very
cases,
important, yes.
not so much in others. All right, we hope you've learned a little bit about how God's created hair in all the different types of creatures He's made and how it's unique, how we can use it to identify things. And until we see you next time, get out and explore all of God's amazing creation.